There is a real chance that you're making several mistakes every time you read Paul's letters. And unfortunately, these mistakes have serious consequences, not just in your theology, but in your mental health and overall spiritual well-being. So in order to avoid all this, let me give you 5 key insights, not just into the life and ministry of Paul, but into what current academia is saying about all of this. The first thing we have to take into account is that Paul was sure that Jesus was coming in his generation, and this shaped all of his letters. Yes, not in his wildest, craziest dreams would he had ever thought that you and me, modern people, would be reading his letters, the letters that he sent to tiny congregations in the Middle East, going through very specific circumstances. These congregations, or at least most of the people that were part of these congregations, weren't supposed to face death because Christ was supposed to come before they died. Just think about it. His letters were crafted for such people, not for people who read his letters on supercomputers in the future. Now, a question for you. How would you write to people being sure that the end of this age, the end of the world as we know it, is coming? How would you write knowing that the letter that you're about to write might be the last letter you ever write? That having kids doesn't even make sense, that getting married doesn't even make sense because Christ is coming ASAP. How different is that from writing systematic theology? The answer is very, very extremely different. We have people confused in the church of Thessalonica because people in their congregation were dying and Christ wasn't coming back. What did this mean for their dead? Now, this is not just because Paul was optimistic or / delusional. This was not just a Paul thing. Most of his apostles, most of Christ's followers thought Christ was coming in their generation. Jesus said it, this generation shall not pass before all of this comes to pass. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all of these things have happened. I don't know, this is funny because sometimes when we read the scripture, we think that this generation refers to us, right? It was their generation. Now, why is this important and why is this the first point I want to make? Paul was not writing systematic theology for all ages. He's not writing church polity for all of the churches in the world throughout all generations to follow. He knew that how a community runs is very contextual. There might be some hints in one of his later writings to show us that he understood that he may probably die before Christ came. But if this ever happened, which is not super clear, this happened at the end of Paul's ministry, at the end of Paul's life. I have alluded to this before a little bit, but the second thing we have to remember every time we read Paul is that his letters were letters to specific communities. We are reading someone else's mail. Dr. Jennifer Garcia Bashar writes that the genre of Paul's writings are an elongated version of the Greco-Roman letter. He tailors his message, his language, and his emphasis to match the situation of that church. The weakness of epistles, however, is that they are not meant to provide universal or systematic treatments of a subject. In the first letter to the Corinthians, we have the famous passage of Paul telling the women there to be silent, and also the pseudo-Pauline passage in 1 Timothy, more on this later, where he says that he does not permit women to have authority over men. But then it so happens that he has 3 female friends, co-workers who are very prominent leaders in their communities, which includes men. One was Priscilla, Aquila's wife. The other one was Phoebe, a deacon. And of course, Junia, an apostle. Not only that, but Paul calls Junia outstanding amongst all of the apostles. It should be very clear to all of us that this woman taught men and had authority over men, which reminds us again that his letters were personal, occasional, contextual, and addressed to a specific community with a specific purpose. Pedants on the topic adds, to read a letter as if it were law is a real mix-up. We need to read Paul's letters as letters. To understand Paul's letters as letters also means to recognize that their content doesn't necessarily mean we should adopt each line as pure, unwavering truth for every context across all time and space. Now, Talking about pseudo-Pauline letters, we need to address here in point number 3 what many people consider to be the elephant in the room. We need to talk about the scholarship consensus on which letters are Pauline and which letters are very likely not Pauline, and how this affects all of us and how this affects how we read his letters. Now, as you can see on screen, there is a list of what most scholars would agree are the undisputed Pauline letters. And these ones include the first letter to the Thessalonians, the letter to the Galatians, the first and the second letter to the Corinthians, the letter to the Philippians, to Philemon, and finally the letter to the Romans. The ones that are disputed, the ones that are there in the middle that some consider definitely Pauline and some would say they're definitely not, are Ephesians, Colossians, and the second letter to the Thessalonians. Now, the ones that most scholars would say they are definitely not Pauline: 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, and the letter to the Hebrews. The real crux of the issue is this: what are you going to prioritize when it comes to the canonicity of a letter or the importance that the letter has for you? Because the question is, if Hebrews wasn't written by Paul, would you take this letter less seriously than, let's say, the letter to the Galatians? Because, for example, we could run this imaginary experiment. Let's say they found a week ago a letter, a second letter that Paul wrote to the Galatians. They just found, and most scholars agree that this is definitely, most definitely Pauline. Paul wrote it himself. What should we do with it? You basically have two options: either prioritize authorship or prioritize the witness of the church. You could say, if it's Pauline, this should definitely be included in the Bible right now. This should be the book number 67th in the Bible. Or you can say, no, this hasn't formed the church for more than 2,000 years. The church is how it is with the 66 books. And even if this is Pauline, we should not include it. And this would be an ongoing debate. Now, this is a question for you. What would you do with the second letter to the Galatians? Would you vote that we should include it in the Bible, or would you vote that we should definitely not? Let me know in the comments. Also, let me know your thoughts on 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, the pseudo-Pauline letters. What are your thoughts? What are your beliefs? How serious do you take these letters if they're not actually Paul's? Now, talking about authorship, did you know that none or almost none of the other New Testament writings existed when Paul was alive? The date for the writings of the other New Testament books are still debated, but what is pretty much not debatable among scholars is that pretty much none of the other letters in the New Testament existed when Paul was alive. It is definitely possible that there were fragments of those letters or different pieces or different versions of those letters that Paul might have read, but the letters as we have them today were never read by Paul. We're definitely sure that Paul never read the Gospel of John, that he never read the book of Revelations, the Gospel of Luke, the Acts of the Apostles. This is pretty important because some of the other writings in the New Testament rely on each other. Like, for example, the Synoptic Gospels. It is very likely that the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of Matthew relied heavily on Mark, but unfortunately, this wasn't the case for Paul. And the fact that Paul didn't have access to all of this definitely informs our next point. Did you notice that there are many elements in Jesus' story, teachings, and ministry that Paul completely omits? We hear nothing about Jesus' birth in his letters, or Mary, or the ascension, or Jesus feeding 5,000, or Jesus walking on water, Jesus' miracles, his healings, Jesus casting out demons. Now, some of us, and this includes me, have thought that the main reason why Paul doesn't mention all of the Jesus story is because he knew there were the Gospels. But this surprisingly couldn't be farther from the truth. And this blows my mind, at least a little blow. Mine a little blown. Because this totally reframes how I understand the New Testament and the Acts of the Apostles and how things happen. I find myself needing to say this because I know the comments that I'm going to read. Many of the Jesus stories and what he did and what he taught were in circulation, especially orally. But what Paul did the most was boast of the direct revelation he had from Jesus, not of all the stories he heard. Now, why did Paul decide to omit all of the Jesus story? The reason basically is up for grabs. I know that many of the things that I said today are uncomfortable for you. They were for me. Now, the best question to ask yourself is, why are they uncomfortable? Because in your heart, you might need me to be wrong about this. And that is totally normal. We need to admit to ourselves, because of our fears, of our past traumas, of the hurts, of our expectations of life, of how we understand reality, we need the Bible to be X. We need the Bible to be this and stay this way for very personal and selfish reasons. And this is absolutely normal. We do this all the time. But we need to look at ourselves and admit that we're doing this. The sooner we admit we're doing this, the better we'll be and the more change we'll see. Now, there's more to say about Paul, like, for example, the fact that Paul never mentions hell in his letters. Never, ever. Bizarre, isn't it? Yeah, and more bizarre are the assumptions we have made on this topic. Most of us need to know what are the assumptions we have made on the topic of hell. So in order to do that, please click on this video and I'll see you right there.